Hi, my name is David. I'm founder and car expert here at Motorenn, and I'm in front of a very beautiful Lamborghini Huracan EVO rear-wheel drive in Arancio Borealis, which is a metallic sherbet orange paint color. This is one of my favorite cars. I think of the cars in this price range, if we're looking at the 488, the Lamborghini Huracan, the McLaren 720S, this would be my take-home car. It's not necessarily the best all around, and I'll explain why, but there are a lot of things to love about this vehicle in particular. I think the main selling point on the Lamborghini Huracan lineup is that absolute screamer of a V10 engine. It's one of the last naturally aspirated engines you can get out there on the market. That V10 and how it's tuned provides this wonderful sound. Ultimately, if you are going down pedal to the metal and it's opened up, it sounds like God's own orchestra going off behind your head. This vehicle in today's market tends to retail used between the high 100s for a higher mileage 580-2 to high 200s, low 300s for a lower mileage EVO all-wheel drive, which is a post-facelift version. I'll get into that in a little bit as well. And there are some special editions that we'll talk about also. The key thing about the Lamborghini Huracan is it combines really athletic looks, and that is, even here in Los Angeles, where people are typically desensitized to these supercars that are on the street, you get a lot of thumbs up and a lot of positive attention for this vehicle. And they combine those athletic looks with, again, a very wonderful sounding engine and a driving experience that's very good as well. It is, again, not as track-oriented as the 720S or for example, the 911 GT3, but it does well enough. It's a little bit harsher in how it drives for daily usage than the Ferrari 488, and I think one of the biggest complaints on the car are potentially the visibility, or rather the lack thereof. Visibility out the back is pretty bad, and then up front you're dealing with almost like a military-style pillbox windscreen. But if you can get past that, it's a great car to own. Ultimately, maintenance and such is pretty good on the vehicle. It's a derivative of the Audi R8. As we know, Volkswagen owns Audi, Porsche, and Lamborghini, and the Lamborghini Huracan is a derivative of the Audi R8 chassis, and there are a lot of parts that are shared between the two cars. So you get a little bit more reliability than you used to get with the Lamborghini brand back 20 years ago. And there is enough difference between the Lamborghini Huracan and the Audi R8 that price premium is very justifiable for the person who wants this type of a car. Actually, kind of comparing those two vehicles, the Lamborghini Huracan lineup tends to be more aggressive in sound, a little bit more aggressive in how it drives, a little bit more attention grabbing. Very different, obviously, exterior look, very different interior look. Otherwise, again, there are similarities in how that chassis feels. One other thing to note about the Audi R8 is that it's a great daily driver. Approach and departure angles on that car are very good. The front overhang of the front bumper is pretty short, and there's a slight angle underneath the vehicle as well that makes clearance on speed bumps and inclines very manageable. On the Lamborghini Huracan with that longer nose, you will scrape. You will absolutely scrape unless you have the front lifter. That is an option on the Lamborghini Huracan, and I very much so would keep an eye out for that. Of note, we've not seen a car without that. On the Ferraris, it seems to be 50-50 in terms of whether those are sold with the lifter or not with the lifter. The Lamborghinis, we've actually have not seen one at all without that option, and it is absolutely critical, especially here in Los Angeles. Diving into the model and choices you have with this vehicle, again, there were two iterations of it. There's a pre-facelift version from 2016 to about 2019, and then there's a post-facelift from 2020 to present. The pre-facelift comes in the 580-2 naming, that's the rear-wheel drive version, and the 610-4 all-wheel drive version. There's a little bit of a difference in the front aesthetics, and obviously there's a difference in the wheels being driven, rear-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive, and power, 580 versus 610. Of note, the 580 and 610, that is Pferdestärke. That's a German iteration or European iteration of what horsepower is, and the American horsepower rating is actually about 8 less. There's about a 1.5% difference between Pferdestärke and horsepower. When we get to the end of the pre-facelift generation, you see the Performante come on scene, which adds more horsepower, a more aggressive exhaust tune, and a more aggressive suspension setup for a very sporty vehicle. And it's probably one of the most awesome vehicles in the Lamborghini Huracan lineup, in my opinion. It's limited in production, only 1,000 or so units made worldwide. Sounds great, looks great, and has that pre-facelift infotainment, which I will actually add, I prefer over the post-facelift infotainment. Post-facelift, that is 2020 and up, they changed the naming to start with EVO, and they demarcate the vehicles by rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. Obviously, there is a change to how the front of the vehicle looks, as well as the back to an extent. Interior-wise, it's pretty much unchanged except for the infotainment area has been upgraded, and you go from this somewhat antiquated, large center console area with a lot of buttons to a more stylish and sleek looking center console with a touchscreen. The biggest complaint about the touchscreen is it's not that responsive. There's very little feedback and there are very few buttons to actually work with. And so it's pretty annoying actually when you're trying to make adjustments as you're driving. I very much so find that if I'm doing something as simple as changing volume, I have to take my eyes off, look at the screen, and look at what I'm tapping on the screen to adjust that volume. It's not great. I'd actually, in many ways, prefer the old infotainment. Another thing to call out about the interior of the Lamborghini Huracan, they do come with a couple of sound options. They have a bass sound system and an upgraded sound system called the Sensorum sound system, neither of which are great. Honestly, if you want a good sounding music system in the vehicle, you may want to be looking at aftermarket options. Sensorum on their other lineups in the Lamborghini Urus, for example, is actually great. And their B&O 3D sound in the Urus as well is absolutely fantastic. It's kind of an afterthought in the Huracan. But then again, look, you're buying it for the V10 engine sound and not the music quality necessarily. When we get into the post-facelift, again, we have a number of variations. We have the rear-wheel drive and we have the all-wheel drive, both of which go up by 30 horsepower or so versus the previous iteration. And then you see a couple more special additions coming onto the market. You have the STO, which adds a very aggressive wing, changes the front styling, and then changes the suspension setup as well. You also lose the frunk in the STO, so it really becomes a track-oriented car, not something that you can use for a weekend getaway. And in some ways, it looks a little bit too mega, honestly, to take on a nice dinner date out. So what we're finding with the STO is because of the production numbers and how it actually looks, that the customer set is finding it's not as usable for them, and that translates into falling values. The STOs went really high in value when they first came out, and right now they're one of the most rapidly depreciating vehicles in the Lamborghini Huracan lineup. So I would generally actually stay away from it unless you're really looking for that track-oriented vehicle. They also have the Storado in the post-facelift version, which is kind of an off-road lifted up version. It's kind of weird, not my cup of tea, but it's also kind of cool. And I get why some people may be attracted to it in terms of how it looks, how it performs, and production numbers were limited. So there is potential for that vehicle to hold value and potentially even appreciate in value as time goes on. And finally, you have the Technica variant, which is the last submodel that Lamborghini came out with on the Huracan before they retired the car, which provides you that STO level of horsepower in a more subdued rear-wheel drive format that gives you back that front. When I think about approaching these vehicles as a buyer, I would be looking at potentially the older 580-2s or 610-4s for best bang for your buck. Those are holding value very well in today's market. I'd be looking for a car in a bright color. It's interesting, on the Lamborghini Huracans, bright colors do very well, which kind of makes sense because it's a Lamborghini. It's actually not the case that we see necessarily on the Ferraris. You know, Ferrari resale red is a big player. Whites and blacks do okay. You get outside of those three shades and Ferraris can be hit or miss. The Lamborghinis, if it's an attractive color, it will do well. So I won't be afraid of a loud color in the Lamborghini Huracan. Other things I'd look for in the Lamborghini Huracan, in the pre-facelift, I would look for the base electric seats. There was an option for a sport bucket seat. That iteration of the sport seat is extremely uncomfortable. The back rake cannot be adjusted, that is, the back angle cannot be adjusted, and so your body shape literally has to fit that perfectly or you are not going to be having a good time. In the post-facelift version though, Lamborghini made some adjustments, and I actually would say the sport seats are the seats to get. The angle of the seat back is adjustable, the bolstering is adjusted a little bit, so it's actually pretty comfortable. I like how sporty that looks, and I like the manual adjustability of that seat as well. The electric seats in the post-facelift EVO are also fine. And finally, I'll touch base on two last things about options to look for. One, again, the sound. You can upgrade to the Sensorum sound. I don't necessarily know if that's absolutely critical on this vehicle. In general, if you want good sound, as I mentioned earlier, you're best to look at some aftermarket options. And then finally, the higher all-wheel drive variants throughout the lineup come with carbon ceramic brakes. If you have the rear-wheel drive variants, they come with steel rotors as standard, and one option to look out for are the carbon ceramics on the rear-wheel drive variants, which add a level of sportiness. That's pretty exciting. The wheels from the factory do make a big difference in how these vehicles look. In the post-facelift, most attractive wheel in the lineup, and probably the wheel that really catches the eyes of our customers, are the Narvi wheels. That's the wheels on this vehicle right here. The upgraded wheels, we do find actually a pretty big difference in how customers react to it and that initial reaction to the aesthetics of the vehicle. So that might be something to look out for. When we talk about maintenance and maintenance expectations on this vehicle, ultimately the Lamborghini Huracan is an Audi R8. An oil change and a service, good maintenance in terms of brake fluid flushes, staying on top of pads, is pretty good. They don't have a very fancy suspension system like in the McLarens. So, you know, shocks and that kind of stuff go bad like normal vehicles. Now, your mileage may vary depending on how aggressive you are with the vehicle, how often you take it to the track, and so on and so forth. But in terms of everyday usage, we're finding that complaints about the vehicle are pretty minimal and pretty in line with most modern vehicles. So in today's market here in 2024, we see that the Lamborghini Huracans have settled into a good place. There was some pricing adjustment from post-COVID prices they haven't adjusted nearly as quickly or as much as the McLaren lineup. And so that bodes well for where this lineup will go. What I do like about it is, again, it is one of the last naturally aspirated V10s you're going to find in the industry. Lamborghini's new replacement for the Huracan has just come out, and it's going to be a flat plane crank V8 with a hybrid system. It's going to sound great, but it's not the V10. It's going to have a lot more horsepower, but again, it's not the naturally aspirated V10. I think the analogy here, as I think about the long-term value of the Huracan, is how we think about the long-term value of the Ferrari 458, which is Ferrari's last naturally aspirated V8, versus the 488 and F8 variants in the Ferrari lineup. The 458s are holding really well in the high 100s, low 200s, and we're not seeing a lot of downward pressure in values. So those are collector items, and this may come into that as well because of the engine. When I look at the lineup in the Lamborghini Huracan, I would say the best buys are probably a 580-2 with low mileage and in good condition. Those are hovering in the high 100s to low 200s depending on mileage and options and color choice. The 610-4, not necessarily critical on it, but it is a little bit more aggressive looking, and if you have the budget, it's not bad to go into, especially because you have the security of the all-wheel drive system for the instances where you do want to be a little bit more sporty in your driving. We do find the 580-2 slightly feels more sporty on the racetrack than the all-wheel drive system, but again, most buyers of these vehicles are not going on track. When we look at what's good from a collector's standpoint and from what we've seen in the market, we've seen the Performantes hold really well. They've been hovering in the low 300s for a couple of years now. And so even in the post-COVID depreciation that's been hitting across a lot of vehicles, that hasn't necessarily been impacting the Performante. I think it's because of the low production volume, the very unique exterior styling, and the sportiness of that vehicle. And I think that's something that will be trending forward as well. So if you have the ability to buy the Performante as a collector's item, that might be worth investing into. I personally think the post-facelift all-wheel drive variant has the best aesthetics throughout the lineup. They only produced that, I believe, in 2020, with 2021 that being phased out in favor of the STO. If it were my money, that's the one I would be looking at. The rear-wheel drive carried on throughout the lineup, and it's a great car as well. As we look at the post-facelift version of the Lamborghini Huracan, those are ranging from about the $250K price point to upwards of the high 300s and low 400s, depending on the variant. I think the best buy there, and one of my personal favorites, is the all-wheel drive version. That's the EVO all-wheel drive. I like the aggressiveness of the front fascia, and I like the extra horsepower and the security of having all-wheel drive on that kind of a platform. A couple cars though that I might stay away from might be the STO. Those are supposed to be a limited production supercar variant of the Lamborghini Huracan. You got this great aerodynamics package, revised aesthetics, very track-oriented suspension system, and you lose the usability of the frunk. Now that came with some trade-offs, and now you get a significantly more track-oriented vehicle, but it's not great for a weekend getaway anymore. And in many ways, the aesthetics are a little bit too mega to go on a date night in that vehicle. So it's starting to lose a little bit of its appeal. And then Lamborghini started producing these with effectively uncapped production. And so it looks like there are estimates of somewhere between 7,500 of these out on the market. Very different than, again, the Performante, which only has 1,000 iterations, and that's bringing the values down. So these went up really high in value, especially when people thought these were supposed to be limited. And right now they're one of the fastest depreciating variants of the Lamborghini Huracan. So I may stay away from that unless you really want one for the racetrack. In that generation, Lamborghini also created the Tecnica, which is supposed to be a kind of more toned down version of the STO, giving you back a little bit more of those creature comforts with that same power package. The Tecnica is a great car. I like the aesthetics, but I think, in my opinion, it's worth saving a little bit, getting, again, the EVO rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive versus the Tecnica. And then finally, they also have the Sterrato, which is an uplifted kind of all-terrain off-road version of the Lamborghini Huracan. It's kind of a weird car, kind of cool, limited production with only about 1,500 cars sold, and that may be something that becomes a collector's item later on down the road. I'm not a big fan of it personally, but I can see why people would like it. Coming back to the top, the Lamborghini Huracan, I think it's a phenomenal car. It sounds wonderful. It drives well. There's some things you're compromising on the vehicle, but I think within this price range for what you're getting, it's one of the best choices there, and it'd be the one that I actually would personally get. So if you like this content where we go a little bit deeper into the vehicles and talk a little bit more about the values and trends and what seems to resonate well on the market, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.